Hello, I'm Robert Riley, Director of the Westminster Institute, and today we're delighted to welcome Mustafa Akyol, a Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. Since 2013, he has also been a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, covering politics and religion in the Muslim world. He is the author, most recently, of Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. He's also written The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims, and Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. This latter book has been published in Turkish, Malay, Indonesian, and unofficially in Urdu. It was subsequently banned in Malaysia in 2017 after Akyol's short arrest by the country's religion police, merely because he delivered a public lecture defending religious freedom. The book's banned Malay edition is now freely available on the Cato Institute website. Before joining the Cato Institute in 2018, Akyol worked for more than a decade as an opinion writer, columnist for two Turkish newspapers, Hürriyet Daily News and Star, until they were co-opted and transformed into pro-government propaganda outlets. His articles have appeared in a wide range of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. He's also the author of 6 books originally written in Turkish, including Rethinking the Kurdish Question, and he's co-author of Ethical Capitalism. He has a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in Ottoman history from the Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, Turkey. Today, he will be speaking to us about the meaning of the Taliban within the crisis of Islam. Welcome, Mustafa.
Thank you so much, Robert, and for this very kind introduction as well. I should say that when I was arrested in Malaysia, we were having a series of conferences, and in one of those series of panels, we actually discussed your book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind. So I want to come back to that. That's why I think we have similar interests there. But let's begin, as you kindly point out. And let me thank you and the Westminster Institute, of course, for hosting this conversation. The meaning of the Taliban within the crisis of Islam. As the title suggests, I will say a few things about the Taliban, my thoughts about what happened in Afghanistan in the past few months and what will happen in the near future. Then I'll bring it to the broader discussion of Islam, human rights, freedom, and the place of the Islamic civilization in the modern world. It was August, a few months ago, that the Taliban took over Afghanistan again for the second time after the US pullout. I'm among those who thought that this was somehow probably inevitable, although the pullout could have been more orderly and maybe things could have been more managed badly, but less badly. But it was, I think, inevitable, and I think there's no point in US occupying countries and trying to save them, liberate them, quote unquote. And I think that idea didn't work in Iraq. That hasn't worked in Afghanistan. So that there are things about the Western foreign policy we should talk about there. But speaking of the Taliban and what it means, there is no doubt that Afghanistan will become a much less free place under the Taliban because its worldview is deeply oppressive. It's a rigid fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, which will be concerning to people of the different gender, women, minorities, especially Shia minority, and also anybody who doesn't believe in the Taliban's interpretation of Islam. However, it is also, to be factually correct, the Taliban seems a little bit less aggressive and brutal than they were in the 90s. Because I think in the past 20 years, they saw the world a bit more. Their engagement with Doha, in Qatar, with the broader Islamic scene, might brought them some recognition of the international reality. They understand that they need cooperation with other countries. They need some recognition. So even for propaganda purposes, let's say, the beginning of their rule has been less brutal than directly as the 90s. For example, I mean, they're saying we will not force women to wear the burqa anymore. That's a full covering cloth, of course. But still, a woman will be forced, of course, to cover the headscarf. And even in the university in Kabul, there are strict dress codes, which include even a face veil. Against the Shia Hazara community, Hazarites are the ethnic group in Afghanistan that is by and large Shia. In the 90s, they have been pretty brutal. And now they are taking measures saying that no, we respect, we welcome them and we're not going to oppress them. We will see how that goes. There are also reports of some Taliban commanders maybe acting on their own, acting brutally against Hazara, or doing things like going to a wedding and killing people because they play music. So I think there is some effort on the side of the Taliban to be a bit more acceptable internationally compared to their extremely brutal rule in the 90s. And that in itself, I think, should not be pushed away. It should be welcome. But we should not be daydreaming and not notice that this is a oppressive group that will create a very oppressive Afghanistan. If Afghanistan is lucky, it will be like something like Saudi Arabia, which is oppressively enough. I mean, Cato Institute publishes Human Freedom Index every year, and Saudi Arabia is typically at the bottom of our Human Freedom Index. With sometimes countries with civil war like Syria can be worse, or sometimes Venezuela, and of course, they're competing people at the lower end of the spectrum. But Saudi Arabia is certainly very, very at the bottom. And the fact that they call themselves an Islamic emirate is actually a implication that it will become something like Saudi Arabia, in the sense that there will be a strict interpretation of Sunni jurisprudence, the interpretation of the Sharia as they understand it, and whatever they understand as the requirement of Islam will be imposed by force. And I think that's the key issue in Islam today, whether the Sharia, God-given law, as Muslims understand it, is it something that has to be practiced by faith, or is it something that has to be imposed by force? And as an analogy, think of the halakha, for example. Orthodox Jews believe in the halakha, that's God-given law. You don't eat kosher. There are some dietary laws. You have Sabbath. I mean, women might be wearing some kind of head cover. Men might be wearing like kippas or hats, but they will do it by faith. So it will be practiced. If you are an Orthodox Jew, it will not be the basis of a state where that kind of observance is imposed in all society. Whereas in Islam, we have this historic amalgamation of Sharia and state and coercive power, and Taliban is a movement that represents that. Now, one thing, Taliban, despite all this, is relatively better than ISIS. ISIS is the darkest end of the spectrum. I mean, I put the Islamists in a spectrum. There are Islamists who want to come to power with political process, like elections. There are the moderate Islamists, and there are other Islamists who want to believe in armed struggle, and Taliban is certainly there. And then at the darkest end of the spectrum, there is ISIS. And ISIS, the so-called caliphate, has been so violent and brutal that it has actually been rejected by mainstream Muslims all around the world. Like, ask even the most conservative Muslims, what do you think of ISIS? They will say ISIS is like Khawarij, the hated first century anarchists, violent anarchists who killed every other Muslim. So ISIS was so extreme and so fanatic that it was by and large rejected. I mean, some people, individuals, were inspired by it. That's why they went to fight in Syria on behalf of ISIS, but that was a very extreme phenomenon. On the other hand, Taliban seems to represent a bit more mainstream, a bit more moderate, and therefore a bit more acceptable and prestigious interpretation of a political Sunni Islam. So that's why I'm when I look around the web these days, I see people who hate ISIS, as I do, as everybody hates ISIS, but they will, oh, actually Taliban is good now. Taliban is becoming this more acceptable model. But it's a problematic model. It's an oppressive model, precisely because what it believes as the requirement of Islam becomes a law of the state, a law of the land that has to be coerced by power. Now, it's also nothing, just to as a terminology here, let's not forget that ISIS claimed itself is a caliphate. That is supposedly the leadership of Muslims that all Muslims have to follow. Nobody recognizes the caliphate except themselves. But Taliban calls itself an emirate, which is a more modest, let's say, claim. Basically, they mean we want to rule Afghanistan. And I think they might back up from some of the policies that brought on them the very occupation of Afghanistan in 2001, which was like support for Al-Qaeda. I think by time they realize that supporting groups like Al-Qaeda brings the US onto them, which is something they don't want. So we may see a relatively more moderate, yet still very oppressive Taliban. And that is bad news for Afghanistan, bad news for the people there. But these nuances, I think, should not be missed. In a recent post at the Cato Institute, I said that ISIS is like the Khmer Rouge of Islamists, which was, if you remember the Cold War, Khmer Rouge was, among all communists, the most violent and the most fanatic and the bloodthirsty one. And Vietnam and the Taliban are like the Viet Cong. So, I mean, Viet Cong was compared to Khmer Rouge actually relatively more moderate, but still it was a communist movement that, of course, oppressed a lot of people in Vietnam and led to a refugee crisis and all that. Now, Taliban is, as I said, one episode in the bigger crisis of Islam. And I'm saying that as a Muslim myself. Not someone who looks down upon Islam. It's my faith and I care for Islam. But, religions go through crises. And I think it's fair to say there was a crisis of Christianity in early 7th century Europe when Catholics and Protestants were engaged in, 30 years war and a lot of bloodshed was has taken place in Europe. People could be burned at the stake for being heretics or executed. But Christianity was able to get out of that crisis by reviving some of its ideas that were there in the very beginning, but also re-articulating them. And I think it's not an accident, like thinkers like John Locke, emerged arguing for a separation of state and religion, arguing for a non-coercive interpretation of Christianity, arguing for states that protect rights, natural rights, instead of states that uphold one orthodoxy against others. And those ideas, I think, took Christianity out of that particular crisis. And I think I believe we are at a John Locke moment in Islam, if we're lucky. That means we are at a moment that we need to establish these ideas and ideas of toleration and freedom and a limited government and the understanding of Islam as a non-coercive practice. Like if you believe in Sharia, good. If you want to believe a headscarf, wear the headscarf. I'll defend you against French secularists and the Chinese regime or anybody. I mean, all my life I've defended the right of conservative Muslims to be conservative Muslims without having any limitation on their practices. However, that's not a law that has to be imposed on the society. Other women have the right to live as they deem fit. People who have to be from different Islamic sects, people who have to be atheists, they all have basic human rights, and the state should protect those rights. Now, is this idea unacceptable to Muslims? Well, Muslims are an incredibly diverse set of people, right? I mean, there are almost 1.8 billion Muslims out there. And I think hundreds of millions of Muslims already think like this. I mean, they are already living in states that are actually secular. There are Muslim majority states like Bosnia and Herzegovina or Albania, which are pretty free, like as the European liberal democracies. And most Muslims there are happy to be that way, to live that way. Most Muslims in Turkey, my country, are happy with a secular state that respects religious practices. Turkey has political problems and a very bad political authoritarianism these days. We can speak about that, but that's a relatively different problem. I mean, and in almost everywhere in the Muslim world, there are Muslims who are interested in these liberal reformist ideas. However, if you look at the orthodoxy in the Sunni and Shiite jurisprudence, again, you will see a spectrum there, but there are certainly tensions between that orthodoxy and the ideas it has about equality before law, about apostasy, about blasphemy, about non-Muslims having the exact same rights with Muslims, or heretical Muslims, being free in their beliefs and in their propaganda, if you will. They certainly have very oppressive interpretations and understandings, and that is there, right there. So Taliban will be yet another test case that this idea that, when we bring this conservative orthodox interpretation of the Sharia and make it the law of the land, people think that, people who support the Taliban think that this will bring wonders, this will bring a pious society, that will bring justice, and this will stop corruption, and this will bring peace and security. It will be a society that was under Caliph Umar or Harun al-Rashid. So that this kind of golden age, which was supposedly run by Sharia as they understand it, and it has to be revived today. What is rather happening is that whenever we have this coercive interpretation of Islam becoming the law of the state, for example, in Iran, we don't see a pious society. We see, first of all, religion itself becoming a cover of hypocrisy or corruption, because once you have people in power saying we are there because God empowered us, our power is preordained by God. This gives them an ample room, and you have little checks and balances in those systems, and that's why it's not an accident that when Islamists stay in power, as we've seen in Sudan, as we have seen in Iran, they actually turn to be quite corrupt as the secular predecessors they have been criticizing. Secondly, the coerced understanding of Islam doesn't make people pious, it makes them hypocritical. It's not an accident that today Iran is the #1 producer of ex-Muslims from Islam, people who lose their faith in the religion and becoming atheists or to become Christians, precisely because they hate the regime and its oppressiveness, and their hatred to the regime ultimately turns against the religion itself. So this combination of religion and state does no good to neither the state itself nor the religion. But some people insist in having this model and trying it again and again, and we will see yet another experiment in Afghanistan of political Islamism. And I think it will be bad, it will fare badly, and as it did in Iran, as it did in Sudan, as it actually is doing badly in my country, Turkey, because as I said, Turkey has political problems, and it is not explicitly Islamic as in the Islamic Republic of Iran, but it's also not a secret that, today Turkey's ruling party led by President Erdogan is using a lot of religious rhetoric to justify its growingly authoritarian and corrupt rule. And it's not an accident that Turkey is also seeing the rise of deism and a disenchantment with traditional religion, because a lot of people are really fed up with this. And so the question is really, will Islam give up coercive power in the 21st century? And I think it requires rethinking Islamic jurisprudence. It requires rethinking Sharia. It requires reopening some theological issues in Islam about the meaning of law. Is law something to be obeyed just for its own sake? Or does the law point to higher values and principles that all humans could understand through reason? So these are important theological issues, and there are interesting theological discussions going on in the Muslim communities about these. But I think this is an interesting time. So I feel like I'm a Christian living in the 17th century, and I see a crisis ahead of me, and I'm trying, as a Muslim myself, trying to make a sense of it and produce some ideas that may help us get out of this crisis.
Well, thank you very much, Mustafa, for those opening remarks. Let's go a little more deeply into the issues you were just mentioning toward the end of what you were saying. Your book on reopening the Muslim mind, I think, contains a brilliant explication of the theological disputes that took place in Islam fairly early on, that defined things for the future in one of several ways. And you do this focusing on the status of reason within Islam, which is ultimately tied to a theology, a certain conception of who Allah is, and how to understand, of course, his revelation in the Quran. Could you start and go a little more deeply into that as you set it forth? And
thank you, and thank you for mentioning my book. There I have a chapter titled "Islam's Beautiful Dilemma," in which I try to put this big division in early Islam about the meaning of law, that is the Sharia. And I begin with a story. It's a personal story. Like I was with my kids who are little 5 and 6 year old, 4 and 6 year old, two boys. And one morning I said, "Don't take your brother's toys," and he said, "Why?" And I could have said, "Because I say so," or I could have said, "Because if it's unfair to your brother, if you do this, he will be hurt and he will be wronged, and you wouldn't want the same thing to be done to yourself." So I would try to explain the rationale behind my commandment, or I could say, "I am saying so as your father, so just obey." So one would establish my command as the authority. The other one would establish the rationality behind my command as the real authority. So I show this to say that in every religion, I think especially Abrahamic religion, the commandments of God that we believe, 10 commandments, can be understood in two different ways. One is to say murder and theft are wrong, objectively so. They are wrong in themselves, and God is reminding us and educating us about these values with the 10 commandments. But God couldn't say murder is right because simply he wishes so and murder will become right. So God is confirming some objective values out there in the world, or divine commandments are affirming some objective values. This is one way. The other way, which is called divine command theory, is that just God commands whatever he wills and his command itself establishes value. So there's nothing called natural law. To speak from refer to a Greek idea which became very, of course, powerful in Christianity, especially Catholicism. Now, in Islam, these two perspectives appeared in the first 2-3 centuries. The view that the commandments of God indicate right and wrong, which is already out there, was defended by the Mu'tazila, the first theological school of Islam. But then this was countered by the Hanbalis and the Asharites, which are the more crude and more sophisticated versions of the same divine command theory. They said, no, things are right and wrong simply because God said so. So theft is wrong because God said do not steal. If God said steal, then it would be good. So there would be no value outside of the Sharia. To conceptualize it, the Mu'tazila said the Sharia indicates right and wrong. The Asharites said the Sharia constitutes what is right and wrong. Now, if the Sharia constitutes what's right and wrong, there are two implications of this worldview. One is that non-Muslims cannot have any ethical value, right? Because they don't have the Sharia, so what do they know? So reason isn't some universal, of course, they appreciate the logic, some techniques of reason, but a reason that finds ethical value was categorically rejected. So why would you study Aristotle or his ethical theory? Because non-Muslims by definition don't have any ethical value. They cannot, because the value only comes from the commandments of God, which are brought to you by the Sharia. So that was a rejection of universalism. The second problem is that if you don't have any values outside of the religious text, then you are bound with literalism ultimately, because you don't have anything else outside of the text to look back and say, maybe we have to reinterpret it. But why would you reinterpret it? Because what else would you have to reinterpret it? So can you be outside of the text in some ethical way or not? So in my view, and I have criticisms to Mu'tazila on certain issues. I'm not a neo-Mu'tazili, as people would say. And I, on some issues, I would agree with the Murji'ites, for example, on the status of sinners and so on and so forth. But anyway, on this main issue, I think Mu'tazila was right, in my view, because I believe the Quran itself, when the Quran itself says, do justice without defining what justice is. because it assumes that people have a sense of justice. There is a verse which says God has given people the badness in themselves, but also their taqwa, the goodness to get away from that badness. So that's there in human nature. So I think the Mu'tazila view was more in line with the Quran and more in line with the human reality we're going through. I mean, today Muslims are sometimes surprised. They go and live in Sweden and they say, oh my God, these godless atheists can be moral people. How is that possible, right? I mean, they park nicely and they're smile and they're never unjust. And well, that happens because there's something called natural moral law. I mean, I believe it still comes from God, but a person can be an atheist, but still could be following the natural moral law. So although he might not be believing in God. So I think these two perspectives are important. And ultimately what happened was the Mu'tazila view was condemned as a heretical view. With the Mu'tazila, also the philosophers, and which were not exactly the Mu'tazila, but just like the Mu'tazila, they went a step further and heavily studied Greek philosophy and Farabi and Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd especially, which I find most important because he tried to reconcile the Sharia with that philosophical perspective. And ultimately this was pushed away as heretical views, and Sunni Islam became established on Asharism and Hanbalism as the far right edge, the Tea Party effect, as some people call it. That was the extreme view that, pushing the mainstream towards literalism. And there was a Maturidi school, which is important actually. The Maturidi school is the theological view that is connected to Hanafi jurisprudence, and that's the most flexible school in Sunni Islam. And Maturidis tried to take a middle position between the Mu'tazila and the Asharites. And on the big issue of this divine command theory, good and bad, whether people could know good and bad, even if there was no revelation, the Maturidis actually stood closer to the Mu'tazila, although they had criticisms to the Mu'tazila, which is little known. It's little known because the Maturidi school wasn't developed much. So Asharism actually dominated Sunni thought. And I think the problem with this divine command theory is that as the world changes, this turns into a crisis because ultimately you have a text. And if you refuse to have a universalistic ethical perspective, you're dragged with the text to something that has taken centuries ago, right? But and the disconnect between the text and the lived reality creates incredible tension. And that leads to blind literalism, it leads to parochialism. I'll give you one example, if you will, to understand what I mean blind literalism. If you look into the fatwa websites, there are lots of online fatwa websites. And fatwa is not a bad thing necessarily. There was Ayatollah Khomeini made it famous by giving that fatwa to Salman Rushdie, but a fatwa means an opinion. It can be a good thing, it can be a bad opinion. But if you look into the fatwa websites of conservative scholars in Sunni world today, you can see discussions on whether a woman can travel alone or not. A Muslim can travel alone without a mahram, that's a male guardian. And some say yes, some say no. And some say, well, she can travel until 58 miles, right? For 58 miles, she can travel alone, and more than that, she cannot travel alone. There she needs to be a male guardian. And this was the basis of the Taliban, part of basis of the Taliban's brutal, limitations on women in Afghanistan in the 90s. They were not allowing women to go alone in the streets because she should have a male guardian, although it was a longer distance, but they even brought it to the city. Now, where does this come from? This comes from a saying of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which says, it's in Sahih al-Bukhari, a Muslim woman, it says a woman should not travel alone without a mahram, a male guardian, for a day, for a distance of a day. In another version, it says a distance of 3 days. And medieval scholars calculated what is it 3 days, how long is the distance? They thought by camels, so they decided it's 50 miles or 58 miles, so they brought these things. Now, if you don't have any value outside of the text, you say this is what the Prophet said, and we will have to obey this. And that's how these male guardianship laws are protected in the Hanafi, among some Hanafis, but especially Hanbalis that are dominant in Saudi Arabia. But another way of looking into this is to say, well, the prophet said so because there were bandits in the desert in 7th century Arabia. A woman walking in the desert by herself would be a prey to these people. So the prophet said something limited with that context with a clear intention. The intention is protection of women or protection of anybody from danger, right? And if you want protection of individuals today, you know, maybe you should be less concerned about traveling alone in the desert, but I don't know, maybe putting a seatbelt in your car, which will be probably driving safely. So do we understand the Sharia, the commandments of God, through an intention-focused understanding, putting them in their historical context? There is a room for that in classical Islam called maqasid, that's the intentions of the Sharia. But precisely because of the theological limitations I mentioned to you, it wasn't cultivated enough. It became fashionable in the past few decades. It's good. I mean, I think it's an important discussion we should have, but we should give up the idea that the commandments are values in themselves that are obeyed for their own sake. There will be commandments obeyed for their own sake, things like prayer or fasting. In terms of worship or ibadat, there might be commandments that are valuable for their own sake, but other commandments should be understood in this lens. And we should take this one step further, I think, and ask why the Prophet Muhammad established a state. Why did he have to fight wars? One way of looking at it is to say, well, he did this because this is the divine blueprint he followed and so on and so forth. Whereas my answer is, well, he did these things because he had to proclaim Islam and he wasn't allowed to proclaim it in Mecca. So he had to flee to Medina and he had to establish a state, which was a requirement of the times. But in the modern world where you have religious freedom already, you don't need an Islamic state. You just need a liberal, classical liberal state that will give you religious freedom. That's all what you need as a Muslim.
So Mustafa, if we can keep our focus on the status of reason here for a minute, because it seems to be the defining issue, and you make it the defining issue in your book. A quote I use in mine is from one of the Mu'tazila thinkers, Abdul al-Jabbar, whose works were discovered in a mosque in Yemen in the 1950s and gives us the clearest idea of what was taught by them. I'm just going to read a quick statement from him. It is obligatory for you to carry out what accords with reason. Obligatory to carry out what accords with reason. Now, I can give you the exact quotes from Augustine, from Aquinas, that say this exact same thing. And Abdul al-Jabbar also makes the statement, and here he is speaking of the compatibility of the Quran with reason. Quote, the right does not contradict the right, but agrees with it and confirms it, unquote. And as you know, this in Mu'tazilite thinking, man, you begin, your first duty is to reason. How do you even know there's a God? By examining the world creation, you come to the conclusion that it's not its own cause. There must be this supreme cause. There's this transcendent God. Well, what's he like? Has he spoken to man? Well, there are multiple claims to revelation. Let's examine them. How do we know which one is true? And again, the Mu'tazilite says through your reason, you use your reason to examine them. And when you're looking within the text, just as if you find something that is incompatible with reason, as just in the Bible, it will speak of God's throne and so forth. So within the Quran it does. It speaks of the throne of Allah, his feet and so forth. And the Mu'tazila will say, well, we know that God is pure spirit. So he can't have feet and he's not, there's no throne. So obviously our reason lets us know this is not meant to be taken literally. But analogically, it's he's speaking to people in Arabia at a certain time, in a certain place, in a certain language, in a way so they can understand what is being said. But he also gives us our reason to know that this isn't meant literally. And the opposing school that you mentioned, the Asherites, the Ashari said, no, you don't conclude one way or the other. You don't, it says what it says and you accept it exactly in those terms, literally.
Yeah, especially the Hanbalites and Asherites. I mean, you're right, first of all, to remind that, we know Mu'tazila school and its ideas today more thanks to that discovery in early 20th century, mid 20th century in Yemen, and because they had survived more in Yemen than in any other places, once they were seen as heretics. Other than that, we know Mu'tazila thoughts by some of their critics. I mean, the Asharite says this is what they're saying, but this is what against them. So that was one source that we knew about the Mu'tazila. But with the discovery of Qadi al-Jabbar, which is the greatest Mu'tazila scholar in the 11th century, we learned now more. And you're right. And the Mu'tazila brought the idea of majaz, that is allegorical interpretation of these anthropomorphic terms used for God in the Quran. That was the first dispute. And Ibn Hanbal, famously the biggest enemy of the Mu'tazila, and by the way, he was jailed, and I'm against that, so there was being kind of authoritarianism back and reverse among both sides. So Ibn Hanbal said, I mean, we believe in these things bila kayfa, without asking how, and God has a hand, God has a hand, so we don't discuss this. But Mu'tazila said this cannot be possible, so we have to allegorically interpret this thing. I should say that some of the Mu'tazila ideas were later silently accepted by later and more sophisticated Asharites. So it was not always Ibn Hanbal's, very strict literalism in the beginning on this issue of particular, how do you interpret God's attributes. But on the key issue of ethics, whether the Sharia, without the Sharia, there are values that can be knowable by reason, Asharism stood its ground. For example, Imam Ghazali, who was way more sophisticated than the early Asharites on many things, and we should accept that. But if you read his Mustafa, the greatest late school, school of jurisprudence on usul al-fiqh, that's the methodology of jurisprudence, he takes some interesting terms. He's very sophisticated in many ways, but he insists on the husn al-qubh issue, which is good and bad, that without the Sharia, good and bad cannot be known. So that has become the staple. And I think today there are some people in the Sunni jurisprudence who are saying, well, this was too much. We insisted so much for that. I mean, there's an interest in Maturidi theology, especially in Turkey, and there are international Maturidi conferences, because people understand that the Asharite theology was just too rigid on these issues and brought Muslims to. So it's not just Mu'tazila versus Asharite, and it's not a black and white, it's more gray. And there were even some late Hanbalites actually that liked Mu'tazila ideas, but then they were condemned for heresy by other Hanbalites. So there's a very complicated history there. But you're right. I mean, there's a theological insistence on divine command theory, which explains some of the problems that we have in the Muslim world today.
But let's also, Mustafa, touch upon what, again, you explicate so beautifully in your book, and that this divine command theory also impinges upon the notion of causality.
Yeah.
And that the Asharites, to be consistent in their thinking, had to deny cause and effect in the natural world, that everything that happened was because of the first and only cause, and that is Allah. And therefore man was simply instrumental, and that of course created huge problems with any notion of free will. So the denial of causality, and you yourself point out that this was a blow to the further development of sciences within the Muslim world, which were flourishing under the influence of the pro-Mutazilite caliphs, particularly the brilliance of the court of Caliph al-Ma'mun in Baghdad, and the house of wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, and so forth, and that this denial of causality in the natural cause and effect in the natural world eroded those foundations and led to a backwardness in in Arab culture because the Asherism became so embedded in that culture.
Exactly.
Is that fair?
That's fair. And I should just say that, I mean, a chapter of my book is exactly on this issue. And I can imagine some people listening to us and they're saying, oh my God, they're, you know, pushing the old Orientalist thesis, which has been debunked by a lot of scholars and so on and so forth. Because this idea that the denial of causality by Ash'ari theology, which is articulated by Imam al-Ghazali again in his majestic books, has led to the decline of sciences. So this theory was there, and then there has been a century-long almost rejection of this theory. The Gaza is known as the Ghazali decline thesis theory. But now actually the tide is turning a little bit again, saying that there was some truth in this original accusation, although it missed some of the nuances of Ghazali. Here's what I can say. Ash'ari theology, as you say, denied two things. One is that the commandments of God are based on ethical values that are outside of the Sharia. It's just voluntarism. So that's a term. That's a theological term. God is acting on his will, and his will is not bound by anything. The Mu'tazila said God is bound by principles too. God cannot do injustice. And the Ash'arites said God can do whatever he wants, and whatever he does is what we call justice. Whereas Mu'tazila said, no, we know what justice is, and we would expect from God to do justice. And one thing, traditional Muslims sometimes see this as disrespect to God. Quite the contrary. Mu'tazila was actually emphasizing a respectable God. I mean, let's not forget that the Mu'tazila were also on the frontiers of Islam. They were trying to propagate Islam. They were the missionaries of Islam to Christians and the Zoroastrians, to other faith traditions. So they were trying to say, our religion is reasonable. Our God is principled. So they were trying to show the beauties of Islam to the world. That's why they were emphasizing the principle of God. The guys in Medina back there, I mean, the Ahl al-Hadith movement, which ultimately became Ash'arism and Hanbalism, of course, they were like interested in just preserving the greatness of God and nothing else. And God does whatever he does. So God even can do unjust things. On the issue of causality, again, Ash'arites saw causality as something that limits the omnipotence of God. If there are secondary causes, so there are things that God does not necessarily intervene in every second, and he accepts that causality. Mu'tazila said yes, and the philosophers certainly said yes. And yes, it's not an accident that the House of Wisdom in Baghdad was founded by the Abbasid caliphs, the early Abbasid caliphs, who were sympathetic to the Mu'tazila and the philosophers, and there was a thriving of science. And the Ash'arite denial of causality, I do agree and believe that in the long run, stagnated Islamic sciences. At least it didn't stop Muslims from calculating celestial movements because you needed that for prayer. So some science continued, pragmatic science continued, but switching to modern science, a Newtonian revolution, that didn't come. And I think there's something to do with the theological shift there. And two scholars have written about this. One is Abdul Hakim al-Sabra, who passed away, who was a great scholar of the Islamic medieval sciences. He's the one who translated Ibn al-Haysam's big work on optics into English. So he's he's coming from Egypt. He was an Egyptian American scholar, and he said that the philosophers had this appetite to discover everything in the natural world, but the denial of causality ultimately decreased in the appetite for discovering this or the workings of the nature, which you find in, of course, Newtonian revolution and the early modern scientific revolution. And also Dimitri Gutas, who's been a great expert on Islam and the Hellenistic connection. Dimitri Gutas is a professor at Yale, world's one of foremost experts on the connection between Greek heritage and Islam. And he, for many years, rejected this decline thesis. But he has a very interesting article, which shocked a lot of people, written in 2017, and I quote that in my book. And he says there was some truth to the original criticism that the Ash'arite theology led to the decline. Now, here, a lot of people focus so much on Imam al-Ghazali, like whether Imam al-Ghazali was the most sophisticated of all Ash'arites. So you can read him and you can say, well, actually, he's coming close to a causality position here. So some people think actually he was believing in causality. Other people say no, no, no. So endless debates about Al-Ghazali, but let's leave Al-Ghazali and respect him. But there was a decline. And you know who wrote about this? Hamza Yusuf, the great scholar of Islam in America and one of the greatest Western scholars of Islam. I mean, I would recommend people to read his article about Medina and Athena and how they diverge from each other. And he absolves Ghazali from the responsibility. He says it was not Ghazali's fault. Again, that's a big discussion. There are Ghazali experts, I will leave it to them. But he says that philosophy died in the Sunni world. And that had a consequence, because if you don't have this worldview of causality and Aristotelian understanding of things, it will have an impact. And in my book, I show an example of that in a very interesting thing on the issue of contagion, which is very timely. You know, we're living in the pandemic era. There was a movement to deny that contagious diseases exist at all in classical Islam. It comes from a hadith, because there's a hadith which says there's no contagion, although there's another hadith which actually seems to say that there's a contagion. But the idea that diseases, there cannot be contagious diseases because God creates disease separately in every human being, that was a dogmatic position. And it's during the Black Death, there were interesting discussions about that, and I showed them in my book. And Ibn al-Khatib, who was a philosopher and a follower of the Ibn Rushd line, the rationalist line, he said there is contagion. And if you read a hadith saying that there is not, but if you see factual truths that there is, you should go back and reinterpret the written hadith based on the facts. So that was one view. The other view was insisting on textualism, blind textualism. And yeah, it had an impact, I think, on the Islamic civilization.
I simply recall, and you mentioned in your book again, that early Islam was assimilationist. Its first philosopher was Al-Kindi, who made very eloquently the very points you do in saying that learn everything you can from those around you if it's good. And the standard of good, once again, is reason. You know, there's this story, at least, that Caliph al-Mamun had a dream in which Aristotle came to him.
Yeah. He saw Aristotle in his dream, yeah.
And he asked Aristotle, what is the good? And Aristotle answered him, it is what is reasonably good. It is what is rational. And al-Mamun embraced this, as of course, and as did the Mu'tazila, as you have laid out so beautifully. Now, we have to turn to one of the most contentious issues within Islam. And once again, in your book, you do not flinch from this issue. I have to say that your treatment of everything in this book is honest and thorough, and you don't look away from difficult problems. You stare right in their face and say, this is a problem, and here are the approaches through which one might overcome them. Now, this is a very dangerous problem, and it touches upon the status of the Quran itself. Mm-hmm. And as you know, the Mu'tazila said the Quran was created. It was divine revelation directly from Allah, and but it was at a certain time, at a certain place, in a certain culture, in a certain language, and it requires interpretation according to the circumstances in which it was given. And you give many examples in the book of your interpretation of both hadith and of various verses of the Quran, where you historicize it. You give the time, the circumstances, the way it was meant to this specific person or this specific group. And this indeed was the approach of the Mu'tazila, but the Ash'ari insisted, no, the Quran was not created. It has coexisted co-eternally with Allah in heaven. Yeah. As it is on earth today, it's the same thing in Arabic. And therefore, that the range of interpretation possible all of a sudden collapses. into the kind of literalism that you were talking about earlier. And a number of Muslims have said, for Islam to get out of its current dilemma in the modern world, we have to go back and reopen questions that seem to be closed back there in the 8th and 9th centuries. And one of them is the question on the createdness of the Quran. As you well know, because you mentioned him several times in your book, Nasser Abu Zaid in Egypt was a wonderful scholar and thinker, and whose autobiography I read, and some of whose articles I have read, who explicates the Quranic passages according to principles and in ways that are very familiar to a Christian or a Jew. They're standard in a way, and that his suggestion that they be examined in this way, in light of the fact that the Quran was created for him those problems which led to his fleeing from Egypt, because he was going to be, his wife was going to be forced to divorce him because a court said he was an apostate. So this is a dangerous thing.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah,
and yet it is something you say has to be reopened and has to be considered.
Definitely.
Could you go into that a bit?
Sure. Thanks for bringing that up. I mean, indeed, the status of or the nature of the Quran is probably the first actually issue to, or maybe the ultimate issue to discuss within the Muslim theology and Muslim community today. One thing, this discussion whether the Quran is created or uncreated, as some people think, was sparked by Christological debates on whether the Christ is co-eternal with God or Christ is created. So because actually we know that John of Damascus asked Muslims, according to your scripture, is Christ created or not? And Muslims started to discuss this. What do we say about this? So there are interesting Christian precedents for Islamic theological debates. Normal, because Christians were there for 6 centuries and they were discussing these things, and they studied Greek theology as well. Not European Christians at the time, but Eastern Christians knew a lot of Greek theology, from which Muslims learned actually. But this issue is crucial. So what does it mean? First of all, I'm a Muslim. I believe Quran is a revelation from God, as I believe the Torah is revelation from God, and I believe Christ himself is revelation from God, because the Quran calls him the word of God, not, he has a different status there. So there is no doubt that, we don't believe in revelation. As a Muslim, I believe in revelation, but was that revelation from God, with God since eternity, and it came down to be a book in the 7th century without any connection with the context there? Or was this revelation from God was more of a dialogue with the early 7th century Arab society? Like God looked into what people were saying and God said something in reverse, like a back. So is it a monologue by God, or is it a dialogue between God and the contemporary society there? So actually, Mu'tazila didn't discuss the createdness of the Quran exactly in this sense, but it comes to this ultimately. Mu'tazila's big problem there was if you say Quran is uncreated, it becomes almost a second deity with God, but that would compromise the oneness of God. So they were more interested in that problem. But today, since we're in modernity, we're looking back in a pre-modern era and see how contextual things there are. And we can say, oh my God, so there's another actually aspect of this createdness or uncreatedness problem. Here's one example. When you read the Quran, you will see that the Quran is deeply engaging with the early 7th century Arab culture. It is condemning, for example, men for doing something called zihar. What is zihar? Well, zihar was a custom when, according to patriarchal Arab men, would tell their wives, you're like my mother's back. So when he said that, the wife would be completely in limbo forever, not being able to divorce or being single. So it was a kind of a way that men used to, keep women in check. Now, go outside of Arabia, nobody knows what zihar is, right? or there were forbidden months, the Arab customs. Go outside of Arabia, even in a few decades later, people didn't know what that was. So the Quran is engaging in these historical situations. And if you say Quran is with God since eternity, how do you make a sense with the fact that Quran is engaging in these very local traditions that are known to not anybody outside of Arabia, and not to modern world today for sure, and doesn't have a meaning even? I mean, you can extract a meaning from that as a lesson, but it doesn't have an application directly. Or like the Quran manages slavery. I mean, slavery was there among Arabs. The Quran called for freeing the slaves, tell that female slave women should not be made prostitutes, which was something horrible that the Arabs did at the time. So brought a lot of compassion to that institution, but also didn't abolish the institution. So does it mean slavery is an Islamic institution because it's mentioned in the Quran ultimately, and you can say it is mitigated but also accepted? Or do we say the Quran just found it in its own context and just responded to it? So thinking whether the Quran is created or uncreated has interpretive results. And actually everybody sees that. I mean, everybody sees Quran is contextual, but how the Ash'arites got away with this? Well, some of them got away with this by believing in predestination. Since God has said these things since eternity, those people were bound to say those things because it's written in the Quran in advance. But the Mu'tazila said, well, then how those people will be held responsible if what they're going to say, if their infidelity is written in the Quran since eternity, how God can hold them responsible? That would be unjust. So God must have given them free will. So if they have free will, they're acting as they wish, and God is responding to their words. So I think this is a key issue. And I think anybody with a fair mind can look into the text of the Quran and human history, can understand is Quran is deeply bound with history. And as a Muslim, my call is, let's understand the divine message in its own historical condition. Let's understand the intentions of God. Let's understand that God wanted to liberate slaves, although maybe that didn't happen overnight in 7th century Arabia. Let's figure out the intention there. Or God gave new rights to women where they didn't have. So that was a very progressive step. So it is a progressive interpretation of the scripture when you understand the Quran as a historical text. But if you don't understand it as a historical text, and if you say, one example, I mean, the Quran says, as a decrees that hands of thieves should be amputated. That is one of the 5 hudud in the Quran, 5, strict, clear punishments for crimes. And implementing this is a big passion for all Islamic movements. I mean, it's there in the law in Saudi Arabia, it's in Iran. I'm sure with the Taliban, it will be law in Afghanistan. Islamic tradition, since it's obviously very difficult to do this in a mass scale, kind of mitigated this. They said, you can't do it right away. There should be conditions. So even in the classical era, it was realized that you can't really implement this way. But few people come and say that we shouldn't do this at all today, never. Well, I am saying that because I look into the Quran and I look at how pre-Islamic Arabs were punishing theft. Well, exactly the same way. Pre-Islamic Arabs were punishing theft by amputation of hands. And why they were doing that? There's a very good reason. There were no prisons in Arabia. A prison is an institution with a building brick and you have to feed somebody there and put a guardian. I mean, that society didn't have that. You need a state to do that. And people couldn't be imprisoned even in Mecca and Medina, where people were living in very shanty houses and so on and so forth. So corporal punishment, immediate corporal punishment, was the only way to punish a crime. That's why Quran continued the Arabic custom of punishing theft with amputation of hands. To me, the lesson is theft is a bad thing. It should be prevented because private property is important. And we should prevent theft and protect private property by the means of the modern world today. And probably it's not amputation of hands anymore.
Let's relate some of what you've said, Mustafa, to what's happening in the Muslim world today. The Taliban I don't subscribe to the views that you have just laid out about Islam. They think the Quran has existed co-eternally with God. They take it literally. I recall a sign painted, this is in their prior period of rule, throw reason to the dogs, it is unclean. And considering the status of dogs in Islam, it's kind of a double insult to reason. So the denigration of reason, etc., the very opposite of the things which you are promoting and say have a source within Islam. So you're not going to find this progressive understanding within Afghanistan now. But what about other parts of the Islamic world? I don't know about what you think about changes in Saudi Arabia, whether they're really substantive or whether a solid foundation has been laid to improve one of the most regressive societies in the world, or for instance, in a place like Indonesia, where I'm quite familiar with the largest Muslim organization in the world, Nahdlatul Ulama, which seems to track very closely with the kind of Islam you are describing.
It is true. I mean, one thing I should remind, especially to our Western friends who might be watching us, is that the Muslims who attract the most attention and make the headlines, especially in the West, are the most troubling ones. So we always keep hearing about the Taliban because Taliban does terrible things, and it concerns people and so on and so forth. But in the world's among the world's 1.8 billion Muslims, I mean, those people who are really hell-bent on amputating hands and flogging sinners and killing apostates, they're not really the majority, actually, in my view. But they are. I don't think so. And I mean, among the clergy, even there's a spectrum. I mean, if you go to Saudi Arabia, that certainly is the official view. Go to Kazakhstan, you will have a authoritarian government because it's post-Sovietic, but you wouldn't have this sort of limitations. There's no Sharia. I mean, there are more than 50 Muslim majority states. Only in a dozen of them, Sharia is in the penal code. Even in most Arab societies, like from Jordan to Morocco, some of these problems we're speaking about, like apostasy, blasphemy, corporal punishment, they're not there. They're not even in the legal system, or even if it is very rarely implemented. So it's not like this one big black, the one Taliban universe out there. I mean, groups like Taliban are making the news because they are the most rigid and the most furious element of this, very rigid understanding of Islam. And there are, as you said, in Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim majority country by its population, Nahdlatul Ulama, as you said, the world's greatest Islamic organization, they have taken pretty liberal steps. I mean, liberal in a classical sense. I mean, in a good sense, I say. They criticized supremacism in classical Islamic attitudes. They called on Muslims to stop using the word kafir, that is the Christian equivalent of infidel, to non-Muslims. Because, I mean, the Quran condemns some unbelievers, but those are the people who had seen the light of Islam. They were polytheists who knew Prophet Muhammad wouldn't lie to them, but they rejected out of greed and arrogance and bigotry. I mean, that's not how the world's majority of non-Muslims are today. I mean, they're just following their family traditions as Muslims are doing. So they called on Muslims to clean some of the things that are in the tradition. They emphasized that Islamic jurisprudence was developed out of a position of supremacy, right? Muslims were rulers and they were tolerating Jews and Christians and others from a position of power and giving them some rights, but not equal rights. That's how Islamic rule was for a long time. And for that time, it was actually not bad. But in the modern era, in the world of equal citizenship, that is certainly not acceptable. So they have taken these steps. My book is going to be published in Bosnia and Herzegovina soon, this book. Others have been published in different Muslim societies. In every Muslim society, there are Muslims who are discussing these issues. It's like 17th century Europe. That's what I said. I mean, in 17th century Europe, there were Christians who were really thinking that heretics should be punished, but others were saying, no, we should, even if they might be heretics, we should not use coercion against them. I mean, people like Roger Williams, who led Rhode Island and, of course, led to the U.S. Constitution. But there were people who believed in the, Massachusetts theocratic, rule as well. So those discussions, I read a lot about those early Christian Enlightenment discussions, and it sounds so familiar to me when I read Locke. And so we're in that age. So these dynamics are there and they're being discussed.
Well, let me ask you, however, about this. The Quran is in Arabic, and it's all Muslims everywhere pray in Arabic, even if most of them don't understand the prayers that they are saying. So Saudi Arabia is kind of the mother country in that respect. As enlightened and progressive as this great organization in Indonesia is, what is the possibility that it would have any influence outside of Indonesia? In other words, within the Middle East itself? Would its views be discounted simply because it's not Arabic, or does it have some possibility of penetrating?
Yeah, I mean, it is true that the Arab part of the Islamic world, that is actually 20% of all Muslims, probably population-wise. There is generally an establishment thinking these are the people who know it, right? I mean, Al-Azhar and Medina and all the institutions there. By the way, of course, Saudi Arabia is not the only country. Maybe Egypt is the center of the Sunni world, thanks to Al-Azhar and the teaching. And Al-Azhar, I have some criticisms, but they have taken some actually progressive steps on some issues, I should say that. Not on political ones, but on, let's say, religious issues. I mean, Nahdlatul Ulema will influence Indonesia more than anything else. Turkey's Diyanet will influence the Turkish landscape more than anyone else. So Muslim world is actually quite now into nation states, and those institutions in those nation states influence their nations. There are some transnational movements, Islamist movements is like that. So there are some ideas going back and forth. But it would be wrong to think that someone who's not Arab will never influence. I mean, Ali Izetbegovic is Bosnian intellectual. He influenced so many people, including myself, from Turkey, and he was a great thinker of Islam from a very liberal point of view. I mean, I can say Iran has a great tradition, although it's Shiite. Some of the Iranian intellectuals, like Surush or others, are influencing some Sunni thinkers. So it's not that clear cut. And the interesting thing about Saudi Arabia is that until the 20th century, the Wahhabi tradition of Saudi Arabia, which is Neo-Hanbali, which is the most strict of all Sunnis, that was such a backwater that nobody would know about and listen to until the 20th century. Then they realized they are sitting on the world's greatest oil reserves and they have all the money to propagate through Islam to four corners of the world. So that's also a part of our tragedy. That the most rigid interpretation of Islam had the biggest financial resources and started to propagate that.
Which they interpreted, of course, as a direct act of Allah rewarding them.
They thought that was a divine blessing and so on and so forth. Whereas I would say, well, it's just kind of natural mechanisms. That's how oil is produced. It's not maybe necessarily a blessing in the way you understand. It's of course blessing in the cosmic scene. But I mean, it is. I can understand why some people from the West might be a little bit pessimistic or looking around and saying that, there's a whole Muslim world out there which is not in peace with human rights and so on and so forth. But it's really complicated. And there are a lot of Muslims who appreciate human rights. There are a lot of Muslims who appreciate freedom. And some of them, just don't think too religiously about these issues. And others who think religiously try to reconcile human rights, democracy, freedom with their religious tradition. And there I try to give them some food for thought. I want to give them some ground to say that this is how you can be a Muslim and who you can believe in human rights and you can believe equality of human beings and live in peace with different faith traditions or other people of all convictions.
Well, I think that's an excellent explanation of the reason for this wonderful book you have written. Now, both you and I often quote one of the great Muslim scholars of the 20th century, Fazlur Rahman. all of whose books I've read.
He's a sheikh, as we say.
Yes, he was a sheikh. A wonderful thinker at the University of Chicago for many years. Some of my friends got their PhDs under him. Now, I was people who don't actually read my book just get upset at the subtitle, because it says how intellectual suicide created the modern Islamist crisis, and they don't bother to read the very beginning of the book, which because that's taken from Fazlur Rahman.
Yeah, he said that.
Let me just read this sentence, and we'll close by getting your reflection on it. Quote, "A people that deprives itself of philosophy necessarily exposes itself to starvation in terms of fresh ideas. In fact, it commits intellectual suicide," unquote. So he sees philosophy as at the center of this crisis, and that the renewal of philosophy is essential to the recovery. Do you see the possibility of that? And again, I know the Islamic world is highly variegated. You just gave a very good explanation of that. Do you agree with that statement by Fazlur Rahman?
I agree.
Do you see a resuscitation of philosophy in certain parts of the Muslim world?
I do. And I mean, yes to both questions. First of all, Fazlur Rahman is really a towering mind, was a really towering mind. He passed away in 1988, I think. He was from Pakistan originally. He was a prominent scholar of Islam. He was targeted by hardliners in Pakistan. He had to come to the United States, and he did teach at the University of Chicago. He was a pious Muslim, but he opened up all these questions, and he's seen the world. He's studied the Western civilization as well, and he realized that we need. I mean, one of his books is titled "The Transformation of an Intellectual Tradition," right? Like he was speaking about this transformation into modernity, into a free society from the Islamic perspective. He is right, and he looked back with to the Islamic tradition with a critical eye, and not renouncing it. But he brought these criticisms that I bring in my book to Asharism, to other things, and to the denial of philosophy. And of course, he was preceded by Ibn Rushd, and who was warning that if you leave philosophy, actually, you would run into trouble. I mean, his critiques towards Al-Ghazali and the broader Ash'ari tradition is very interesting, and I actually go through them in my book, The Opening Muslim Minds. Is there interest in philosophy? Yes, there is. I mean, in Turkey, for example, my country, we have ilahiyat faculties, which are theology faculties, where philosophy is there, it's being studied. Some Greek philosophy has been retained just in terms of logic. What happened is there was a door opened in the very beginning through the early Abbasid Caliphate. A lot of ideas poured in, and some gatekeepers of orthodoxy, like Ghazali, limited that, saying that, okay, that much is too much, but we can get this much, we can get logic, we can get some mathematics and so on. But then even Ghazali was found too much philosophizing, and he was rejected by some later hardliners. So, and when you don't have philosophy, you don't have access to the universal wisdom. So Aristotle doesn't mean anything to you. Hayek doesn't mean anything to you, right? I mean, or Thomas Jefferson doesn't mean anything to you. So, because you don't give any epistemological value to human reason. You think it's hawa, it's all desire, it's all temptations of, whereas, the Quran makes a distinction between reason and hawa, which is temptation. I mean, these issues are being discussed, and modernity, one problem is that modernity also came to the Muslim world sometimes through colonialism, and that triggered an extra reaction, a more strident reaction. And today I see also some educated Muslims trashing everything out, saying that this is all colonialism, whereas we had the right to oppose colonialism, but on the other hand, we should have engaged with modernity in the intellectual sphere. I think this is going on. The reason why I quote so many contemporary thinkers in Islam today is because those people are there. I read from those books because they're experts on every issue that I'm really digging into. So there is an intellectual struggle. There are these intellectual discussions going on. And a lot of Muslims intuitively, even if they don't engage in philosophy, they understand that there are societies that are doing not bad, and those are the societies Muslims want to migrate to, right? So, I mean, why nobody migrates to Saudi Arabia or Iran? Everybody wants to come to Germany, Canada, or US, and there's a reason for that. There's more justice, there's more prosperity, there's more opportunity. So a lot of Muslims also intuitively understand that. And they somehow bridge that with their religious tradition. I'm just working on the intellectual intersection of making that intuition more meaningful and more mature and go forward. But there are a lot of people working on this in the four corners of the Muslim world.
Well, and you do a brilliant job of that. I can't commend your book too highly.
Thank you so much.
But I think you were arrested in Malaysia.
Yeah.
I think there are other parts of the world to which you would go if you were going to speak in this way, what you would be arrested to. Do you feel yourself in danger from this enterprise you've undertaken so courageously, I would say?
Well, my wife would agree with you. That's why she bans me from traveling to many parts of the world, just in case. And indeed, I was arrested in Malaysia. I mean, it was a one-night arrest, but it could have been worse if we didn't have the diplomatic, channels to make it end shortly. I mean, there are countries in which when you have these ideas, yes, you may get into trouble. But there are other parts of the Muslim world you can freely discuss these things. And even if countries where the religion police will not allow you to have a panel on this, the internet is there, the world is out there. So a lot of people are having access to all these conversations. And so I think the internet revolution will, I mean, it's also utilized by the radicals for sure, by groups like ISIL, Al-Qaeda, but also it's opening up minds among Muslims in all these issues. So yeah, there are countries I don't go to, but I can do a Zoom call as we're doing today.
For which I thank you again, Mustafa Akyol, for joining us today to discuss the Taliban and the crisis in Islam. I invite our viewers to go to the Westminster Institute webpage or YouTube channel and see our other offerings and discussions about Islam, China, Russia, and other subjects. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bob Riley, the director of the Westminster Institute.